My understanding is that the act that governs your work doesn't require you to go to law enforcement with anything that you find that might be criminal, whereas in the Integrity Commissioner's case, the legislation that governs their work does. Do you think that anything criminal happened here, and do you think the OPP should investigate?
We have a section in our Act that says we can provide advice or information to those within the public service. The OPP is within the public service in Ontario, so that is sort of that pathway. You know, to be honest, we had a meeting and we've had discussions, but my understanding is yes. And my understanding is that, you know, whatever happens in the future will be up to the OPP to decide whether there is merit in looking at any situation further.
Can you tell us what those discussions entailed with the OPP?
I can't. You know, it's not something we've put in the report, and I think it's probably best if there is any decision by the OPP at any point in time that they decide whether they take, you know, pursue anything. You know, we're not the police, so we're in our lane here.
Do you think the police should investigate?
You know, I think I'll leave that up to them to answer. You know, our work is in the report, and I think, you know, anything else beyond that is either with the Integrity Commissioner or with other parties.
Auditor General Lysyk, you tried to speak to a couple of developers, and you did issue summons, I believe. What did you want to speak to them about? What questions did you want to ask those developers specifically?
I think, you know, broadly, we wanted to understand their perspectives on the lands that they had, on the, you know, why their lands were selected, what their thoughts were when they were asked about their lands being removed from the Greenbelt or told. So I think it's normal to have heard from them and heard what their perspective was on the decision making around the removal of the lands they own from the, or are developers for from the Greenbelt.
Follow-up, please. What documents and information did you have access to whilst conducting the reviews? Was it mostly based on interviews, or were you given more access than that?
You know, we have, we don't particularly detail all of that information in our report, but I can say we have a scope section where we did say there were limitations to our work. And we have a section in there that says, should anything else come to our attention, that the office would consider pursuing any and conducting any additional work that's necessary.
Are the prominent developers we're talking about who challenged your orders for an interview, are they the same prominent developers mentioned in the September 14th event?
Yeah, I think you can, from our report, you could probably get that is the case, yes.
Did you reach any conclusion on what the Premier's role was in this while he was defending these decisions?
You know, I did meet with the Premier and I asked pretty direct questions of the Premier, and in all cases he indicated that he was not aware of the specifics around the selection of the land, and that he did not tell anybody to put in submissions for the removal of the land. So that is the information I received from the Premier.
Do you believe the Premier when he said that, and or the Housing Minister, that they actually had no knowledge of this and it was all just this Chief of Staff?
You know, I have no reason not to believe them. I think given everything we've seen, I think that, you know, our recommendations stemmed from that as well, because if you're not aware of a process where decisions, pretty important decisions, are being made, then, you know, it makes sense to revisit those decisions in light of new information. So that is how we've handled this.
Are you saying then that this is just one rogue chief of staff who did this all on his own and broke protocols and rules?
I think what we're saying in there, we are questioning that somebody could, you know, manage an initiative like this without any type of supervision or oversight. And so the way we've concluded on that is that we do say we do believe the minister ought to have known. The minister indicated to us he did not know, but given the importance of this, it would have been, I think most people would have presumed he would have been aware.
If he was given this responsibility from the Premier's office, should they not have known and been aware as well?
So we've had those discussions. We did a number of interviews, and we have no information that would confirm that he was receiving direction, particularly from anybody specifically.
And the allegations have long been that someone in this government tipped off developers that this land was going to be opened up, and where. Has any of that come to light? What is your response to those specific allegations?
I would say in the back of our report we have an appendices that has a timeline. And, you know, the Chief of Staff started in his new role at the beginning of July, and then a couple months later material starts being given to the Chief of Staff. So we do wonder how that process came about and why people would bring material like that and provide it to the Chief of Staff. Having said that, we have no other information around that situation to you know, to outline in the report today.
Are you suspicious?
You know, I think you know, we did get I think had good information provided to us of how things proceeded, but naturally there are a few questions, like sometimes we have on other audits, that are unanswered, and I think what we have in the report is answers the question of how the lands were selected from the Greenbelt, which I think was a key ask of us when we were asked to do this audit.
Following up the Auditor General Lysyk, the idea that a Chief of Staff would receive packages at a dinner, and that these packages, as it turned out in your report, included land that made up the majority of these lands that were then going to be made available. Does that seem kosher to you? Does that seem normal to you? And then, as Global reported, you know, there was the Stag and Doe where the developers were at the Premier's party. When you put two and two together, what does it add up to?
So during the course of our work, we saw a lot of communication. So I guess the premise here is it's okay to lobby in Ontario. It's okay to try and get your interests met. It's how the receiver of that information handles what they receive from lobbyists. As a result of what we saw during the course of our work, we put recommendations in here that we think are needed to be looked at to address some of the concerns around what are the roles and responsibilities between the public service and the political public service. How should materials that are received from people that are lobbying for their purposes and be handled and shared among the political staff and the non-political staff? So there, and the Integrity Commissioner's role in looking at all of this. So I think there is a bigger picture around all of this in terms of more understanding of what the roles and responsibilities are in working with third parties that are vested interests. So we've addressed it that way in the report.
Auditor, how did you find out that this package changed hands in this September 2022 meeting?
I think we've indicated that the Chief of Staff did cooperate with us, and the Chief of Staff indicated that that was the case.
Premier Ford, not too long ago, said that, you know, you're out of your lane for looking at this. This is not in your purview. You're supposed to look at budgetary items. How do you respond to that?
I think the key thing here is that everyone refers to the term value for money, but maybe look at the root. I'm an Auditor General, audit. Our office is the Office of the Auditor General. We're auditors. Auditors look at information and want to communicate how processes work or are not working throughout what we look at. We're completely in our lane, and we've always been in our lane. The thing about that type of comment that I find you know, I listen to and I accept, is that it diverts attention away from the reports that we write and the work that the office does. So it's not just about the Auditor General or about Bonnie Lysyk, you know, it's about the content of our work. And I think comments and even different articles that divert are not doing justice for the people in Ontario, because it's the content of our work that's really important to get at versus, you know, personalities or are we doing the right work. I think when there is a concern raised, the issue should be about how does the concern get fixed.
You talk about preferential treatment for some lobbyists in part of your report, and you mention staff be setting up investment opportunity meetings. What are these meetings, and how frequently do they happen?
Yeah, I think, I'm comfortable leaving it as it is in there to just indicate that, there are issues, I think, that need to be thought about. I think, there is that definition of what is policy and what is operations. So opening the Greenbelt, but is picking the lands to pull out of the Greenbelt really policy, or is it something that requires expertise? So what we've done in that section is indicate that there are situations where outsiders can influence operations of government, and that's where we think more attention is needed to define that line between reliance on a qualified civil service, experts in municipalities, experts in conservation authorities. Political staff have a role, but is it to make absolute operational decisions?
In this report that public consultation was once again subverted, and it wasn't done adequately and sufficiently. You found that for Bill 23 as well, and a couple of reports before then, too, if I'm remembering correctly. It seems like the government hasn't taken the past recommendations you made about improving the transparent consultative process when it comes to environmental policy changes. What would you say after this thorough investigation you've done in Greenbelt changes?
I would say that is an important thing to keep your eye on. I find it is really dismissive and disrespectful of people who write in and have concerns about things that don't get their concerns addressed. So there needs to be some change and recognition that when we all spend our time responding to what looks like a consultation process, that it's respected. And I think what we've seen over the years, that consultation in a number of cases, especially with respect to the Environmental Bill of Rights, sure, there's a mechanical process. You put something on a registry and you ask for a 30-day response. That's the mechanical side. But the real side is, what is the content of what you're getting responses to about what you do? And I don't think we're seeing full responses. And the other is the timing. So is it realistic, especially in the case of this situation, to have asked people to respond to something as important to people as opening up in an area that has some will have environmental impacts to it, and ask for 30 days? And if you look at that response time too, it also there was another one that was posted that it was just after a municipal election, and you're asking municipalities to have input when they don't even have a council in place. Like, that whole consultation area, I do believe, needs to be rethought and really respected. Otherwise, you get a population that doesn't believe it makes a difference whether you comment or not. It's like whether you vote or not,
Is there any recourse for the public or for the Indigenous communities or even municipalities that weren't consulted for all these major land use changes?
I think recourse is probably voice. I mean, I don't speak for the Indigenous community, but they did tell us they had concerns. But I do think, go just a little bit, maybe it's part of that answer to that question, but also I'm just thinking as I'm speaking here that what's really important too is that you have a very important role to play as a media to have people understand where their voice needs to be heard, or if it's not heard. So I would say there's a lot of new people coming to Canada, and perhaps some of these issues are new, and they might not have all the information they need to make their own decisions around things.
Auditor, you're saying this one political staffer with a very accelerated process, a few envelopes at a dinner, is able to provide $8.3 billion in additional value to these developers. Should this guy still have a job?
We have a recommendation in the report that there be a referral made to the Integrity Commissioner to see whether or not there was a breach of the Ontario, the Public Service Act of Ontario. So we've indicated that in the report. I do know the Integrity Commissioner is also conducting their review and will be reporting publicly and might have more to say.
Auditor General, notwithstanding this particular staffer's role in all of this, do you agree that the buck stops with the Premier's office, because the Premier's office appointed that person to conduct this work and to take on this responsibility? Was it the Premier's office responsibility to be accountable for it? The document that was approved by all of government was a cabinet submission,
and so the cabinet approved the removal of the lands. That document was provided just a couple hours before cabinet. So I would say, you know, the decision ultimately was one of the government. I think I go back to why we made the recommendation we did, is that given what we saw during this audit and what's in the report, that there's ample support for looking at the removal of those specific land sites. So given we were told that that document was not as complete as it could be, perhaps decisions were made that might be worthy of a second review.
What was incomplete about that document?
It didn't speak to how the lands were selected. It also didn't explain that what the limitations of the criteria used were and how the criteria evolved and changed. There was also an implication that the lands could be developed quicker, and we know that that was not an assessment criteria. We know that the ministry had indicated they did not have time, or they weren't able to contact municipalities or conservation authorities to ask for good information as to how that land or when that land could be developable.
But you have a small number of people making billions. You have protocols that were not followed. You have the land that was changed so that it did meet the criteria when in fact it did not. Is something stinky here?
Yeah, we have concern around what we saw, and hence I think you'll see the terminology that we've used throughout the report is this is a flawed process, this was a biased process. We saw what we think is preferential treatment. There's answers still to be obtained in a few areas. So I do believe we are saying this was not, we aren't even referring to it as a process in our report, we're calling it an exercise.
Is any of it criminal in nature in your mind?
You know, that's outside of my purview, so, you know, it wouldn't be fair for me to comment on that.
On what on Minister Clark, no, there's a part in the report that says there was a letter sent by a lawyer to his chief of staff, but the letter was to Minister Clark about one of the parcels of land that was ultimately removed, one associated with Shakira Ramtula, who went to the wedding and just followed the wedding. Did the minister ever read that letter? And if he did, is it possible he didn't know what was going on by his chief of staff?
I think, you know what, I think that would be a good question for the minister. All we know with respect to that is that was material that was then provided to the ministry to use as information as to what lands to look at for removal.
Or is there a reason you're not using his name?
We typically don't name people in our reports. We try and use the titles of people in our reports.
This is the current chief of staff.
This is the current chief of staff.
Okay.
Bonnie, you know in your reports, in your recommendations, there's recommendations about records retention, personal use of emails, and of course there was the developers who filed in court to resist some of what you were asking for. What are the gaps of what you were trying to figure out that you weren't able to? Were there any that were significant?
Yeah, I think we made those comments because we did do email reviews, and in some mailboxes we can see information that we would have expected to see in other email boxes. I wouldn't say we were extremely concerned about what we didn't see, but we were concerned that there might not be clarity around what is kept and what isn't kept, and hence we made that recommendation. Also, you know, when you're looking at people having meetings, especially when meetings are with third parties, that it would be a good practice to document the purpose of meetings in meeting agendas, and so we didn't see a lot of description around some of the meetings that we were looking at.
Were there any particular parts of the SAGR, I guess the story behind how these lands were chosen that you weren't able to identify, that still to you is a mystery after doing this work?
You know, I'll just back up a step too. The other part of this is we do have a comment in there that information can sometimes be sent to people's personal emails, and we wanted to emphasize in the report that government business should be on government emails, not on personal emails, and that because that is a risk as well, because personal emails become then subject to FOI. I think what I would say is that right now, based on what we know, we think our report is complete. Could there be other information over the course of the next while that becomes new information? We did put a paragraph in our report that indicated that would be something we looked at. So I guess I'd say, never say never. That there might be something else that we haven't looked at, but we feel pretty confident with the material that's in our report. And I think what's important about it are the recommendations, and that they're timely.
Looking at the preferential treatment of lobbyists, you mentioned that there was a practice of taking possible wording for legislation from lobbyists and then putting it in a folder and sending it to the deputy minister. Can you tell us what any particular legislation was affected by that practice?
I can speak to what we have in the report only without getting into details. But I think generally it could be that sometimes the civil service, so the non-political staff, might be asked to do something or to use certain information without understanding where that comes from. Whether it's an instruction from a premier, whether it's instruction from a minister, whether it's actually political staff that come up with that idea, or whether it's a third party. And what we're saying is that there should be clarity around all that, because what we did see is perhaps that misunderstanding happening.
What is going to happen now with the legal challenges from the two prominent developers? Are you still going to be trying to get to enforce your order to have them sit down, or is that moot at this point?
So, we had tried to have just meetings. That didn't work, so we did issue the summons, and the summons were, there was a challenge, and I made the decision that it's why would we do that? Why would we again go through an exercise to get information that really we should be able to get under our act? So bottom line on that is, it's in the report, it's referred to the Legislative Assembly. We have two sections in our act. One says we can talk to people to get information. The other says we can use the Public Inquiries Act. The Integrity Commissioner has used the Integrity Inquiries Act and summonsed, and to him, there was a positive response. So right now where it sits is, I made it very clear through our legal counsel that we're not pursuing that way, but we're open to conversation, and should there be a decision from the developers that they'd like to talk to us, we're open to hearing from them.
Auditor General, you spent 6 months on this. It's a comprehensive report. There's some pretty damning conclusions. There's a lot of information in here. What do you think about the public trust? Because the public looks to you in the course of looking at this report and saying, she did this work, she issued these recommendations, she had access to all this information, this document. Should the public have the feeling out of all this that the government got away with something because they pushed this through, the process wasn't done according to the way that you say it should have been done, but what are we going to do about it at this point? Deal is done, monies are going to be earned, profits are going to be substantial, but what's the upshot? Do you think the public should feel like the government got away with something here, or that there's any recourse at all?
I think the thing is, I don't know if it's too late to make a different decision. I mean, I think the implication is just because the decision was made in the past that it has to be followed through with. I mean, there's been other decisions that have been reversed. I would say, if you think to your own personal situation, if new information is brought to your attention on a decision you've made, chances are you're going to sit back and reflect and go, you know what, was that the right decision, or should we be doing something else? So I would say I'm not sure it should be, the decision should reside where it is without a second reflection. So that would mean to me then, if it wasn't looked at and re-reviewed, that everybody's okay with how the decision was made.
Would you like it reviewed?
We recommended that based on the fact that both the Premier and the Minister did not know how these lands were selected. And now you know what this looks like, and you see basically that it wasn't a fair process. It would seem reasonable to have made that recommendation.
Tell you about the loan recommendation that they did not accept.
And I should stress, we had very good cooperation from the current Chief of Staff to the Premier, from the Secretary of Cabinet and her team, And there is agreement on 14 of the 15 recommendations. That is likely one that both the minister and the premier themselves will have to, with government, would make a decision on how they address it. But I think the chief of staff to the premier was very comfortable in providing responses to the other 14.
But it was this reassessment that they did not agree with it?
There isn't, we don't have a comment of agree or not agree. That the way it was left is that'll be a decision of the government.
Particular recommendation, though.
Correct.
Auditor, how believable is it to you that the housing minister did not know what his chief of staff was doing in personally picking these 14 of 15 properties? Do you believe that?
So when somebody says to me, I was not involved in that process, I did not know how the lands were chosen, I believe. Having said that, do I believe that that he should have known or he ought to have known? Yes.
Do you believe that would be a wise decision or helpful for rebuilding public trust by having the current chiefs of staff or possibly Minister Clark relieved of their positions?
You know, that's not for me to comment on or decide, right? That'll be a decision that the government themselves will make in terms of how they move forward.
Auditor, you said the owners of the removed sites could see more than a $8.3 billion increase in the value of their properties. You write that it came out of a valuation from 2016, 7 years ago. Could the land not be worth much more given that?
Definitely. It's definitely more than that. You're absolutely right. Those are 2016 numbers. At the time when we were obtaining information from MPAC, that information wasn't available, but it likely will be available as time passes. So it'll be a fair amount more.
When do you think we might know that?
You know, that'll be a question for, I think that's a good question to ask the ministry as well as MPAC on what their estimates of it are.
Given you're coming to the end of your 10-year term, we're talking about a one-day decision or a few weeks decision that delivered at least $8 billion to the private sector. Can you compare this over the other issues you've had to wrestle with? Where does this one fit in terms of how egregious it is?
You know, they're all the various work that we've done over the last 10 years has been very different. Each file is unique. I would say this one is unique in the sense that when we started the work, we thought there would be a financial process to look at, and we thought there would be an environmental process, and so we were ready to go and look at those processes. And then we recognized that there were no processes here. This was this exercise. And what it meant to us is that I had to work in clearing the report both with the political side of the government as well as the non-political side. And I would say that's what's unique about this report, is that typically when we do audits, we clear our work with the people that are involved, and we're auditing the work of the non-political staff. In this case, it took us into a bit more of the political governance structure, and but I think we were successful in clearing this report and working through as best we could under the circumstances. So that's what's unique to this one. That's what I'll remember, is the unique clearance process that we worked through on this file.
What do you think about having a full public inquiry about this?
You know, that's not for me to comment on. That's a different territory.
Did you, in your office, look into if anyone in the government personally benefited from any of these decisions?
We have nothing in our report identifying that anybody personally benefited from this.
Was that something that you asked or looked into?
You know, that is something that we thought about. You know, again, there is probably more work to come, more reporting from the Integrity Commissioner. But I don't have a response to that.
Well, it sounds like the question might have been asked.
Yeah. I think it's a question to be asked, but we didn't. We did not report anything on that.
Sure.
We'll go to the phone lines now for questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to ask a question, please press *1 now. Once again, if you are dialed into the audio conference and you would like to ask a question, please press star 1. There are no questions from the phone lines.
Your successor will be chosen to be less confrontational with the government, or be less to dig into things like this, because they don't want you to be in this lane. Are you worried that whoever they choose next will be someone who will stay in whatever the government determines to be their lane?
I think it's important that the person that comes into this role knows how to do the work, in the sense, what is the role of an auditor? And it's important that the panel that is being put together to hire the auditor thinks about that, no matter what party they're involved with, because at some point you're government and some point you're opposition, and what you want is somebody that will, and I hope I've done this, is tell it like it is. At the end of the day, it's not a, it's how can I say this? This is a role that, there was an article written the other day. It says, everybody hates Bonnie, but she's successful. And I'm going, okay, I'm not out to be hated, and my objective was just to do good work. But I think what's important here is to keep your eye on that selection process. The panel is a government member and an opposition member. So those individuals have the power to select an Auditor General. The vote in the legislature is, I believe, 75%, not 100%, but it's at the committee level that it'll be important. I do believe, I do believe they'll try and find a person that will be 100% equipped to do the work for Ontario.